Okay, so we've talked about groups. We talked about dyads, triads, uh, small groups, large groups, primary groups, secondary groups, etc. Now let's talk about social networks. Now, when we hear social networks, we oftentimes immediately think of Facebook or Twitter. These are modern social networking sites, that's true. But in terms of sociology, what we mean by social networks is basically who you know. Okay, it's a set of relations, basically a set of dyads, so relationships between two people that are held together by these ties between these individuals. So if you know Barbara and Barbara knows Bob, now you have some kind of tie to Bob, even if it might be very weak. You still have some kind of tie. So if you need something that Bob has to offer, you can ask Barbara, and she might be able to offer, you know, to link you guys together, and so on and so forth. That's what we call a social network. And when I say tie, I mean what links you with another person. So your book talks about a story being told between you and another person. So, for example, if you have a sister and your sister has a best friend, your relationship to that best friend is the story between you two is okay, that's my sister's best friend. So you have that's your tie to each other. Social networking like Twitter or Facebook have made traditional social networks even more complex because you can have ties to hundreds of people at the same time. One advantage of these technologies is that it's relatively easy to see these social networks and to study them and research them. A disadvantage, though, is that it's difficult to see the importance of these ties. So you can be friends with 300 people, but how important are these ties to these individuals? Now, in talking about researching social networks, one benefit of doing research on social networks is that it can reveal patterns in social structures that might not become evident through individual interviews. And you have to remember that, like I mentioned earlier, a lot of our behaviors and our beliefs and our values are influenced by other people around us, and especially those people that we spend a lot of time with, and especially those people that are in our quote unquote primary groups, because again, those are the most they have those groups have the most impact on our own lives. So if we're researching something like obesity, for example, um, we can only learn so much by doing things like interviewing, participant observation, etc. But if we start to take into consideration the social network of people who are considered obese in the United States, we might um, recognize certain patterns that we may not have been able to see otherwise. So, for example, researchers have found recently that people who are considered technically considered to be obese tend to have close friends and sometimes family members who are also obese. And this is profound because what that means is that you're being surrounded by people who have the similar problems, similar lifestyles. So, if you eat a certain way, the people who you're with can have a profound impact on that. So if you're surrounding yourself by people with people who are eating the same kinds of foods and the same amounts of foods, this can be an enabling factor. Now, let's talk about embeddedness and the strength of weak ties. So, embeddedness and the strength of weak ties are two concepts that refer to the types of relationships, the type of tie that you have to another individual. So, for example, embeddedness says that the more indirect paths that you have towards a person within a social network, the stronger the tie is. So, let me give you an example. If you have a cousin who has a friend, and so your tie to that person is simply that that's your cousin's friend. But if that friend also has a sister that's married to your brother, suddenly that tie becomes stronger because not only is that person your cousin's friend, but it's also your sister-in-law's brother. Now, the strength of weak ties states that relatively weak ties between people. So, for example, um, if you're talking about your best friend's sister's husband's um, cousin, okay? That's a very indirect tie. It's a pretty weak tie. But what strength of weak ties says is that these weak ties can often be the most beneficial and most valuable ties because it's these types of ties that can offer certain types of benefits and certain types of rewards that may not be available through people that you're intimately tied to. So, for example, if that person who I was just referring to works at a job and you want to get a job at that same place, um, you might be able to have that connection because you know somebody who knows somebody who knows this person. So this relatively weak tie oftentimes ends up being valuable, and that's very, very important. And what we really call that is we call that social capital, and that means how many ties that you have to individuals throughout your social network. So, what it means also is that the more information, affiliation, ideas, and connections that you have help you enter pre-existing networks, help you gain power. So, if you want a top tier job and for example, you want a marketing job at Johnson and Johnson, you are much likely to get a position like that if you know somebody. And it's true that most people in the United States get jobs through people who they know. So if you know somebody who is, an advertising executive at Johnson and Johnson, or you know somebody who knows somebody who knows somebody that works in this type of position, you're more likely to get that job. And I say this is profound because social capital is a valuable resource that not everyone has access to. For example, people in the upper elite, upper class, people whose parents are executives or lawyers or politicians, these people are at a much higher likelihood of landing high paying or powerful jobs because they're in that network. Their parents know somebody who knows somebody who can get them a job. And so it allows them to stay within that class. Now, organizations are also social networks, but they're instrumental. So, in other words, they serve a common purpose and they offer group membership, quote unquote, meaning individuals within an organization must be members, not anyone can join. And this differentiates the organization and the members involved with the rest of the outside world. It makes it a separate entity. Now, here's some examples of organizations. You've got a picture of the VFW logo, you've got a picture of a Moose Lodge on the left, a sports team on the bottom right, and even Mercer County Community College. These are actually more formal organizations, and there's a difference between formal organizations and informal organizations. Formal organizations tend to have some set of governing authoritative structures. They tend to have rules, formal arrangements. So, for example, in Mercer County Community College, we've got a dean in every department, um, and that is everyone's boss. That's all the teachers' bosses. You've got in the classroom a hierarchy, of course, with the professor and the students. Even in church, you have a hierarchy between the churchgoers and the pastor or preacher or priest. Even a book club can be considered a formal organization because there are rules that everyone has to follow. You have to read the book and you have to be ready to be engaged and discuss the chapters. And there has to be some kind of hierarchy because there's got to be someone deciding who reads what book and how things are going to run within the book club meetings. Informal organizations would be things like fan clubs or a relaxed poker club, where there's not a lot of rules, very informal. Now, when we talk about the difference in beliefs and norms within these different organizations, we're basically talking about organizational culture. So, what are the beliefs and behaviors of the organization? Is the organization conservative or liberal? Liberal? Is the aim to do good or to do something illegal, etc.? An organizational structure, on the other hand, is how the organization is structured in terms of power and authority. So, is the organization a top down organization where workers or members are given little freedoms or opportunities, or whose members don't have much of a say in the overall workings of the organization? Or is the organization more free and open, where members are given freedoms and benefits that don't necessarily have to follow rules and answer to a boss or some higher authority. So there's a lot to be said about groups and organizations in society, especially in the post-industrial world we live in. Society runs on various types of organizations. We have work organizations like stores, restaurants, various types of firms, factories, etc. We've got medical centers, government bodies, religious organizations, unions, you name it. And all of these organizations, which are essentially institutions, all serve some kind of purpose and are ultimately needed in society. They can also serve as a source of identity for people involved. In other words, these organizations not only serve some kind of purpose to somebody, but they also become part of the self-identity of members who are involved in the organization. So, for example, if you're a member of a country club, you become not only Bob, but Bob who is a member of such and such country club. It becomes part of your identity. Or if you're a member of a fraternity or sorority, these are oftentimes the lifelong commitments, and your involvement with the fraternity or sorority can transition into big moments of your life. For example, I went to a wedding recently, and the bride and groom both had their fraternity and sorority present, and after they did their first dance and everything, they had some special little celebration involving their sorority and fraternity members where they sang a chant and did a special dance. So these organizations serve a purpose, but also become part of who we are as people. And I guess I'll leave it at that. So I'll end this chapter and see you guys in the next chapter.